Hi, Josh.
Hey, Ramesh, how are you?
Fine. How are you doing?
I'm doing okay. It's uncharacteristically cold and damp here, but whatever.
I'm sure those of us on the East Coast are feeling very sorry for you right now.
Yeah, no, and believe me, I appreciate that sympathy, and I think it's really authentic. So, good day for you. You have a new piece that's out in National Review Online. Is that right?
It's actually in the magazine itself.
It isn't, I see. And it's on about Huckabee, and it's a kind of friendly bye-bye. Is that fair?
Well, that's, yeah, I mean, I do think that he's fading. I've never really taken him seriously as a contender for the Republican nomination. I mean, I figured he could have effects in the race, but not that he could ever possibly win the nomination. And I explain why in the article, and I sort of go on to talk about how I think sort of coalitions should handle what are essentially splinter movements like Huckabee's. I mean, basically, the reason he can't he couldn't be the nominee is that there aren't enough evangelical Christians. He based his campaign to a large extent on trying to rally evangelicals toward him, and that kind of strategy isn't going to succeed with an overwhelming majority of evangelicals. And if you're just getting half or less of the evangelical vote, that's just not enough to get a nomination.
So this is it's a point you make in the piece in National Review. This is different from the kind of more class-oriented analysis of the Huckabee campaign that David Brooks has been advancing.
Yes, that's right. Look, I mean, I think that David is one of those who believes that the Republicans and conservatives need to do a lot more to appeal to low-income workers, and in particular to actually have an economic agenda that serves their interests and is promoted as serving their interests. And I think that Brooks is absolutely right about that. But I don't think... I think there are two problems with seeing Huckabee as a kind of avatar of that type of politics. One is that his actual agenda is very light on ideas that might actually help low-income workers, and his fair tax proposal, I think, would be pretty clearly a devastating blow to those very workers. And second, that's not really how he has made his mark in the Republican primaries. If you look at the exit polls, it just leaps out at you how evangelical heavy his support is.
So where do they go now? Where do the evangelical supporters go now? Do they go to John McCain, hold their nose tight and go to John McCain? Do they go to, I don't know, do they hold their nose even tighter and go to Mitt Romney, or break their nose off and go to Rudy Giuliani?
I suspect that a very small proportion of Huckabee's voters are going to go to Giuliani. Keep in mind, some of them aren't going to go anywhere. I mean, it's not as though Huckabee's campaign is costing him a lot of money. He can stick around, hope for a broker convention, and hope to do well in the southern states on Super Tuesday. Yeah. So I wouldn't necessarily expect Huckabee to drop out. I would expect his vote to fade a little bit.
But as it's fading, do those voters drop? Do those voters drop out? They don't vote at all, or where do they go to?
I'm not sure it's going to be a decisive block. I can see some of them going to McCain, some of them going to Romney. I think right now we've got a 2.5-man race on the Republican side with McCain and Romney, and then Giuliani a little bit on the sidelines. And if Giuliani places behind McCain in Florida, whether that's in the second or the third position, I think that his campaign is over, and it becomes a simply McCain versus Romney race. My guess would be that more of Huckabee's people would go to Romney than to McCain, but McCain's going to get a pretty decent amount of them too.
So there's something puzzling about this, isn't there? So you think that the Huckabee voters are they've been appealed to as evangelicals and they're voting evangelical. Romney, these are not arguments that I like to get in the middle of, coming where I come from, but I mean, Romney is a Mormon. He's not a Christian. And So is that going to be a hurdle for a large number of those evangelical voters? And maybe make the question even more pointed. Do you think it should be a hurdle? Is that something that ought to bother them?
Well, first of all, we should note that whether Mormonism is Christian is a disputed, controversial topic. There are a lot of Mormons who consider the Church of Latter-day Saints a Christian religion. But it is certainly true that most evangelical Christians don't believe that. As for my own views, I'm a little bit of an outlier.
If I could just pause on this for a minute. So
Sure.
it's Christianity without Trinitarianism. Is that? I mean,
right.
I've said this before on Blogging Heads. It's not a conversation that I think we want to be occupying ourselves too much with in American politics about whether you can be Christian without the Trinity. But other people put it on the table.
If what you're suggesting is that, say, Methodism and Catholicism have more doctrinally in common with each other than either has with Mormonism, I think that is a fair statement. That, sort of in the historic line of Christianity that Mormonism departs in more significant ways than other religions that describe themselves as Christian. As for whether it should matter, my own view on that is that you couldn't in principle say, I think, that a religion should never matter to a voter. But I think it's hard to make the case that this candidate's Mormonism is really going to matter in terms of what kind of president he would be.
But let me ask that.
Sure.
Let me turn the question, push the question one step further. Then, so Romney has taken the position, as I understand it, in his religion and politics speech,
right,
that it is an important factor that the president be religious rather than non-religious.
I'm not sure that is the case. I think what he said was that his religion informs his values, and it's the values that are what is decisive. Now, he rubbed some people, including me, the wrong way because he talked about how people of different faiths had contributed to America, and he didn't say anything about people with no faith. He didn't really say anything about agnostics or atheists, but in subsequent remarks he has, and he has made it out as though that were an oversight and not a sort of intentional slighting of agnostics and atheists.
Yeah. So the thing that I guess I'm puzzled about here, Ramesh, is that on the one hand, and we can maybe get into this more later on, but on the one hand we have the position that religiosity matters a great deal to politics and political conviction, and that religion shouldn't be excluded from the public sphere, et cetera, et cetera. But then, at the same time, we have the view that the real substance of religious convictions can't really matter that much. They can't really matter that much because a core element of the religious convictions, you're suggesting that a core element, defining element of the religious convictions of Huckabee supporters, namely their convictions about having to do with the Trinity, and I don't mean that just as a formal doctrine, but their convictions having to do with the special, intimate, one substance, different persons relationship between the Father and the Son, that is irrelevant. And it's something that worries me. I'm not unusual in this, which is that what happens when there are two things that happen when religious convictions play a large role in politics. One is that people stick with the real substance of their religious convictions, and then you have really terrible conflict. And the other is that the religious convictions themselves get desiccated. Their substance gets evacuated because people look for some kind of, very abstract general ideas that all believers endorse. And, what they all endorse doesn't really have any substance or meat or at all. So I feel like there's some...
We end up with a sort of in God we trust religion.
Yeah, we end up with an in God we trust, and you say, who's the God in whom we trust? And we say, well,
We'll bracket that off.
Yeah, we're not going to worry about that. So I think there's a, when you've got a religiously pluralistic society, including both a plurality of religious traditions and also people who are not religious, either atheists or agnostics or just not really, committedly religious, that you get this. Either you end up having bad religious fights, as when Huckabee says, the Mormons think that Jesus and the devil are brothers, not his smartest move, or you end up with this, kind of the July 4th, patriotism equivalent of religion. In God we trust, but we're not going to talk about who God is. Not good for politics or for religion.
Well, I think there's a lot to what you just said. Let me see if we can try to separate some of these religion and politics questions. And you could probably come up with a lot more categories than I'm coming up with off the top of my head. But it seems to me that we are often talking about sort of three distinct types of thing. One would be sort of governmental acknowledgments of religion, things like under God and the Pledge or the Ten Commandments in a courtroom. Another would be policy issues where many people's views are deeply influenced by their faiths, and here abortion would, of course, leap out as one of those top issues. And then third would be the question of whether and to what extent a candidate's religion ought to affect your voting behavior. And if we could just zero in on that final question, I guess my own perspective on this would be that it's not a great, dangerous violation of an important principle for somebody to place a great deal of weight on that issue. I mean, it seems to me people can vote for whatever reason they want to, foolish or wise, but it does seem to be one sort of unreasonable to attach too much weight to it. And second, I sort of run through the numbers, particularly in a pluralistic society, it seems sort of counterproductive to do that. Politically counterproductive. To switch back to sort of category 2, these issues that involve people's religious faith. One of the reasons I, for example, in making the pro-life argument, try to make arguments that are in principle accessible to people of any different faith or no faith at all, is because those arguments are in fact the reasons I hold the position I hold. But it's also true that in a pluralistic society they're more likely to be successful arguments. So I don't think there's anything sort of in principle wrong with the legislator making a religious argument for a pro-life or a pro-choice policy, for that matter. But I think fundamentally the reasons that I think are the most valid reasons for making policy in this area do not depend on any sort of religious authority, and that you're more likely, in, as you say, a pluralistic society, to make headway with people if you try to bring them around to your way of thinking on that issue rather than convert them to your religion first.
Right. So, we're both, it sounds to me like we're both broadly on the public reason team.
Right.
With maybe some subtle and arguably in some cases some not so subtle differences. I wanted to make one observation about this religion and politics issue. I was very struck by a comment that John McCain made a few days ago. And he was looking forward to running against one of the three current Democratic candidates, and he said, these are all people he knows from the Senate. They're all people who he's worked with. And he said, and they're all patriots. And I thought that was a pretty good thing to say. And very, very different from saying, I look forward to running against them and I work with them. They're all Christians. And I was glad that John McCain said that they were all patriots, because that seems to me, I may disagree with John McCain a little bit about what exactly patriotism comes to, but that consideration that if patriotism means that they're devoted to the good of the country, that seems to me to be an obviously relevant consideration. And whether they're believers or not, or good Christians or not, doesn't really seem to me to be seems to me to be entirely irrelevant to their qualifications. I did want to add one point, though,
Sure.
on your second category about policy arguments. I think I'm not sure when you say it's fine to make a policy to make a religious appeal in a policy argument. I'm not sure which of two things you mean, and I think they're really quite different. The first is that it's okay, entirely appropriate in the course of a policy argument to acknowledge your religious convictions and to observe that those religious convictions are cohere with your view on the policy question. It seems to me entirely different to say that the justification, the argument that should sound in the political arena for adopting the policy, the case for it is a religious case. So when Governor Huckabee says same-sex marriage against God's law,
Right.
And if Governor Huckabee is offering that as a reason for not having legal protections for same-sex marriage, that I think is a really bad and very dangerous attitude to have. And I think not unfair to think that maybe he was saying that, although I would happily back off on that if he...
I think that interpretation is correct. I mean, I don't think... I can't really see an alternative interpretation. I would say, look, I mean, that is not the type of argument that I would myself ever make. I just think that in a country where a strong majority of people are religious, and where for most people morality and religion are inextricable, and where a lot of policy issues involve clashing moral convictions, there's just a limit to how much you can sort of police the argument in line with that kind of principle. And I think that I guess I just don't see it as quite as dangerous as you do, and I also think that sort of seeing it as dangerous and trying to sort of extirpate that kind of argument from our public life is kind of a fool's errand.
Well, I think we're on the same side on being disturbed. If I understood what you said, we're on the same side in being disturbed about what we both think was Huckabee's argument. That is the rationale for a legal regulation that confers marital status only on heterosexual couples. That the rationale for that legal regulation is that that same-sex couples violate God's law.
Yeah, that strikes me as an unsound argument. If that's what you're getting at, that is not in fact a valid justification for law. That I think is right, and I think on that point we do agree.
Yeah, I guess I would go one step further beyond saying that it's an unsound and invalid justification. I mean, if Governor Huckabee had said you shouldn't have same-sex marriage because the man on the moon said that it's no good, I think we would also agree that that's not a sound justification. This one seems unsound and in a more disturbing way, if I can put it that way. And I thought you were
well, to switch back also to something else that I was saying, it's also, I mean, to the, I'm fairly persuaded that in the long run the argument against same-sex marriage is simply not going to prevail. But this type of argument against it seems pretty well calculated to have it not prevail. I mean, the people who should most, I think, be interested in supplying the Governor Huckabees of the world with different arguments are precisely those who share his conclusions about what our policies ought to be.
Right. No, I agree with you about that. Of course, whether there is this raises a very complicated question, one which we can't get into here, which is if you discard the argument, if Governor Huckabee,
then what's left? I mean, how much of an argument can you rationally make?
Yeah, maybe there isn't a good argument, and then you're stuck with you're stuck with the conclusion that you got to live with this because in a pluralistic and democratic society where you're looking, as you said earlier, where you're looking for arguments, reasons that are accessible to a wide range of people with very different convictions, and that you accept that as a limitation on the kind of justifications that you're prepared to give for coercive law. You may be stuck living with a lot of things that you don't like, but that's. I mean, on my view, that's kind of. I guess that's life in the big city. But it's also a good thing because I think that kind of inclusion. That's, I think, an important political value. To be inclusive in that way, not just in giving rights to everybody or benefits to everybody, but
giving reasons to everybody.
Inclusive in giving reasons to everybody.
While we're on the topic of religion and these primaries, there's been some talk. I suppose most preeminently, Richard Cohen, the liberal columnist, raised this question about sort of Barack Obama's 2 degrees of separation from Farrakhan because, his sort of a guy who's talked about quite a bit, that Obama's talked about quite a bit as having played an important role in his spiritual life, gave an honor to Farrakhan. And, of course, Obama himself said, distance himself from Farrakhan. But do you think that sort of thing is a relevant or legitimate question?
I think relevant. I don't know what the answer is, but I think it's a relevant and legitimate question. I think though I have to say I do think the answer in this case is like waiting right next door. Just look at Barack Obama's life and activities and convictions and what he says and what he does, and the idea that he is a creeping Farrakhanite, I find just implausible in the extreme. It's just the opposite of everything that he's about. So I guess in some broad and general sense of legitimate question, sure, legitimate question, but it does seem to me like the answer is standing right next to us.
Yeah, my own take on this was that Cohen's argument was close to something that is a reasonable concern, but he didn't quite frame it correctly. But the problem isn't so much the distance or lack of distance from Farrakhan. The problem is this I guess his name is Wright, the Reverend Wright, that he is himself a troubling figure. But at the end of the day, however troubled you are by that, I do think Obama himself, as opposed to his associates, is the guy who's actually running, and that ought to be what's considered.
Yeah, I have to tell you, this is a kind of footnote to this conversation, and we can come around to Obama. I'm much less troubled by that than I am. I like Obama quite a bit. The thing that I am troubled by about Obama is that his chief economic policy advisor, Austin Goolsbee, wrote a column less than a year ago in the New York Times throwing sort of some cold water on concerns about subprime mortgages. It was a very interesting analytical piece, and if he were just a kind of, very smart, brilliant and decent person, University of Chicago economist, it would have been a fine thing to do. But he was already a policy advisor to Obama's. This is in March 2007. And it's an interesting piece. It makes a very, very good point, which is that the new mortgage instruments, you could think of new mortgage instruments that emerged over the past 30 years as a kind of perfection of the mortgage market, and a perfection of the mortgage market that enabled people with low-income people to get into the mortgage market, because the kind of perfection that the subprime mortgages introduced was that you'd worry less about somebody's current income and more about their future income. So you could kind of collateralize against your future income. And this is good for poor people. And so good for more perfect markets, and in being good for more perfect markets, good for poor people. But this is in the middle of this is a piece written in the Times in the middle of Senate hearings on that Senator Biden was running on subprime mortgages. And, the best take I could put on it is that it was a kind of don't throw out the baby with the bathwater argument. And thus understood, it was fine. But in the setting in which it was offered, where people were trying to do something about an emerging serious problem, to have somebody come in and say, oh, no big deal, don't worry about it. I'm more worried. I'm not very worried about that, but I'm more worried about that than I am about, speculations about Obama's association.
There are advisors and advisors.
Somebody who knew somebody who did something to somebody. That doesn't really trouble me very much. Yeah.
Well, I haven't read the Goolsbee article in question, although I've had one or two dealings with him, mostly from the 2004 campaign, actually, when he was a Kerry advisor. And I've read one or two papers of his, and they've all seemed pretty good. Although, obviously I don't agree with his bottom line on some issues. But, I suspect that, he's saying, I doubt that he's saying that, subprime never got out of control, or that there should have been no regulations, but that this is actually a credit instrument that has helped increase our homeownership rates. And I think that is true, and it is worth keeping in mind as people are complaining about these.
Absolutely, no. It's a great point that this was, as I say, a kind of imperfection in the mortgage market that had a kind of inequitable consequence.
Right.
Very good point. But in the setting in which it's made in a setting which is this is not a meeting of the American Economic Association.
Right.
It's made in the setting. It's made in the kind of New York Times economic scene article, and it's written partly in response to concerns that were being raised in Senate hearings on subprime mortgages, and I think it showed a certain want of
sort of political instincts,
political instincts, particularly for somebody who was there early with, who's been there from the beginning with Obama. But as I say,
So has Paul Krugman attacked Obama over this issue yet?
I haven't. No,
he seems to be on a real tear against Obama.
I think
a lot of these sorts of issues, economic issues in particular.
I think I am on previous sessions of Blogging Heads with Glenn Lowry, I've talked about the virtues of Obama over Clinton. Truth be told, I've been supporting financially, in small amounts, supporting John Edwards largely because I think he's played an extremely constructive role in driving the policy debate on the Democratic side. I don't expect that doesn't really seems like a very low probability event that he's going to win, but I think he's been a very important player, and also now I think is an important player in keeping the level of discussion a little bit more adult than.
What did he say the other day is part of the grown-up wing of the Democratic Party?
He's part of the grown-up wing, and I think it's a very fair statement. And Bill Clinton, unfortunately, is trying to lead us back to kindergarten in the style of politics, and that's part of the reason.
I do find the Obama-Clinton debate on Social Security sort of interesting, from the perspective of an outsider who doesn't wish any of them well. In that, as conservatives, people like me tend to think that Democrats love nothing more than to raise taxes on the rich. But given an opportunity where they have to choose between saying let's raise taxes on the rich or let's deny that there's a major Social Security problem, a lot of folks on the left, judging from their attacks on Obama over Social Security, would rather deny that would rather say that he is exaggerating the Social Security problem. And what I think is sort of interesting is it's kind of the triumph of all of these ideas that we've seen with George Lakoff and company over the last few years, where it's all about the framing. It doesn't matter if, in a certain sense, Obama's policy of forthrightly more forthrightly saying let's raise the payroll tax cap is more in tune with what the left ought to want. It's not something they want if it's attached to a framing of the issues that they think sets them back.
Well, I think the general point here is, and it's connected to the Paul Krugman issue. Mm-hmm. They're basically the competition between Clinton and Obama. I think on the policy side, there's very little blue sky.
Right.
The Times endorsement of Clinton makes this point, and I think that seems absolutely right. I mean, there are some policy differences between them, and on most of those policy issues, other than health care, I think that Obama has the better side in the argument. I think on Iraq, he has the better side. I think on criminal justice reform, he has the better side. I think on some of the immigration issues, he has the better side. But the policy differences aren't very great.
Right.
But I really do think that there is something different in the in their political styles. And I think the caricature of Obama is that it's all kumbaya all the time. And the caricature of Clinton is, it's all
slash and attack all the time.
Slash and attack all the time. And the thing is, I think that there is something to those caricatures.
Something to those characterizations, but they're just exaggerated.
Yeah, and I think that I think Hillary Clinton would probably be a good president. Mm-hmm. I will support her strongly if she wins the nomination. But I really do think that the country does not now need politics of that style. And I think Bill Clinton has just been bringing it back in, and I think it's been very destructive.
It seems as though we get sort of 4 days worth of somewhat nasty back and forth, with more of the nastiness coming from the Clinton side. And then you get sort of a 2-day lull where all the stories are about, both sides drew back, in the interest of party unity, and then it starts up again. My sense, and I'd be interested in what you think about this, is that this race on the Democratic side has become such a slow grind, and it's become so racially divisive that it's not going to be pretty or pleasant. That it is going to be more sort of, if you want to put it this way, that the Clintons are going to sort of drag Obama down, and if he's going to have any chance of winning this nomination, he's going to either have to figure out a way to sort of just fight back, or he's going to sort of have to figure out a way to transcend this, where he's neither a wimp nor right at their level.
Yes, I think that's two points there. First, a kind of sidebar point, and then to come to the issue that you were just raising more directly. There's a very interesting phenomenon that I think hasn't been analyzed enough yet which is the demographic group that is providing Hillary Clinton with her strongest support now is Hispanics.
Right.
Running in the 60s, and Hispanic women in particular. And there are lots of ways of explaining that. It could be a kind of old-style politics. Clintons have been providing lots of favors to through their Clinton political machine for a decade and a half. But it, this also
and
could be
also
a kind of
strong
racial politics issue, and it's
that's
disturbing.
very interesting.
And I think
yes.
it's an unfortunate.
And the Clinton pollster, I believe Sergio Ben-Dixon, sort of kind of said that almost openly. Yeah. I think one thing that's being underanalyzed here is that Clinton has also done pretty well among Catholics. It's almost like she's sort of running on the sort of Hubert Humphrey, Walter Mondale.
She's winning Reagan Democrats. I mean,
in the Democrats,
kind of, lower income, less well educated white Democrats.
But some of the Hispanic support may reflect that.
Absolutely,
I mean, it may be an artifact of Catholicism and.
It could be a religious thing about Catholicism. Could be class. Could be political favors, or it could have this unhappy racial division. But to come to the thing that you were saying, I mean, I think that. Look, Hillary Clinton is a brilliant person and a sharp political operative. Bill Clinton, brilliant, really sharp political operative. And I think that they have fixed on, a very smart strategy, which is you attack Obama and he has two choices. One is not to respond, to do a kind of Mike Dukakis 1988, look like a wimp, look like a jerk, look like he's not up to the game, which is what they're saying about him. Or he does what he did some in the South Carolina debate, fights back, and then John Edwards comes in and says, oh, you're both playing the same game. This is, playpen politics, and the American people need and deserve something better. And then what's happened at that point is that Obama is giving away his strongest point, which is that this is a new kind of politics, whatever exactly that means. It's not, slash and burn. It's not, fight the people who are closest to you because they're your worst enemy because they might take the victory away from you.
Right.
And so I think it's been very effective. And I think when you look at something...
I'm sorry.
Yeah, go ahead. No, go.
I think the way this is working out now, it is likely, I think, that Clinton wins the nomination, but she wins it in a way that will make her have to do something that she is going to absolutely hate, which is put Obama on the ticket.
It may be, although if I can use an ugly
it's
metaphor,
in interest to take it.
Yeah, I mean, that pool may have already been peed in a little too much.
Right.
I mean, it's, but look, here, I at least am way out of my depth and level of connection. Who knows? I'm sure the Clintons could make silk out of that sow's ear of having, attacked Obama and said it was all a big fairy tale. Then bring him in. But I think a related danger of the style of campaign that Clinton is running is that I think it's reinforcing precisely the kind of image of her that's going to make it very hard for her to beat a John McCain, who's, has his own moments of, absurd outburst. But you run McCain against Obama and you have a real competition for independent voters. And we've already been watching that in the primaries where the independents can vote wherever they want. And one argument about why Obama didn't do as well as expected in New Hampshire was that the independents said, oh, I see, Obama's ahead by 10. I want to go and
I'm going to go
McCain.
Play in the Republican primary,
Exactly. And so, I think if what Clinton does is to reinforce in the campaign against Obama people's perceptions of her as a kind of a divisive figure and a kind of lightning rod for criticism and negativity, then makes it harder for her to win the campaign. I think there's an interest. Yeah, go ahead.
And we've got slow grinds, I think, on both sides. I don't think that either Romney or McCain can be knocked out by any outcome in Florida. That's at all likely. And it's just at this point, it's become a delegate hunt. That winning this state by this margin just doesn't matter, except insofar as that it affects the allocation of delegates.
Right. We've been talking a lot about
Sure.
the Democrats. What's your view on the Republican side? I mean, who do you like? And
Well, I'm a little
And
torn
why?
because I think McCain is a more electable candidate than Romney, and I could certainly live with McCain, including on the issues I disagree with him. On the other hand, I would probably prefer Romney as president because he's closer in line with my views. Now, he has come pretty recently in line with my views on a bunch of issues, but I actually think that he would be likely to stick with them. I think it would be extremely difficult for him to switch as president. I think, right after the South Carolina vote, there was a real... there's a lot of discussion about how McCain is now the front runner. Well, if he was the front runner at all, he was a weak front runner, and I think we've seen that. Where now the conventional wisdom is that Romney is going to win Florida, and I just think it's just sort of bizarre to expect if Romney didn't get a boost from winning Michigan 4 days before the South Carolina primary, why is McCain going to get a boost from winning the South Carolina primary 9 days before the Florida primary? That's one reason that I think that he's not going to do all that well. Another thing is a lot of the people who were, right after the South Carolina primary, we heard some discussion about how Rush Limbaugh and Mark Levin and all of these right-wing talk show hosts are spent force. And a lot of the reason they didn't have the impact in South Carolina that they might have is they don't have a candidate that they're backing. And they were against both of the top two people in that race, and they couldn't really pick between McCain and Huckabee. Well, it's a totally different dynamic in Florida, where any attack they make on McCain is not going to help Huckabee, and Huckabee's not really playing at this point. I think at the end of the day, being the last mainstream conservative left standing is not a bad position to be in, particularly if you have a lot of money, and I think Romney's in very decent shape. I might even at this point give him the edge.
Yeah, there's an interesting fact about Romney support, which is if you so people who are supporters, and how this is going to play out in the rest of the primaries and in the general election, I think is a good question. But if you look at supporters of the Iraq War, very strong Romney supporters.
Right.
Not McCain supporters, though McCain was a supporter of the war, critic of its execution, but critic of its execution in supporting a more enthusiastic execution of it. Kind of likes the idea of being there for 100 years if necessary. So here's the speculation, and which leads to the issue about how that kind of support for Romney plays out in the rest of the campaign and the general election, which is, my guess is that the Romney support from Iraq War supporters is not because people are thinking who's got my foreign policy views, who supported the Iraq War, who's going to prosecute it best. It's that being a big supporter of the Iraq War now is a kind of proxy for being a Bush supporter. So these are sort of, if I can put it this way, these are kind of Bush dead enders. These are Bush's 30%.
Well, it's also being a conservative, right? I mean, that's where most conservatives are, and you've seen that McCain has had trouble getting a majority or even a plurality of conservative voters really in any of these primaries. He's come close to getting a plurality in some of them, but he just hasn't done it. I think that one interesting thing is that McCain is getting the anti-Bush Republican vote right now. He's cleaning up there. And I've always thought of McCain, for all of the obvious reasons, as being a big break with Bush. That, in particular, I think he would have been a more competent executor of the Iraq War. But lately,
I've been wondering... That's a pretty low standard, Ramesh.
I'm sorry, what?
I said that's a pretty low standard, more competent executor.
But lately, I've been wondering, though, whether there are some commonalities. In certain respects, there are more commonalities between McCain and Bush than there are between Romney and Bush. And what I mean is this. I do not at all get the sense that McCain is interested in the details of policy, particularly in domestic policy.
Yes.
And second, I do get the sense that McCain's appointments as president would depend a fair amount on who he likes personally, who's in his comfort zone. And both of these things seem to me to have had really disastrous effects on Bush's governance. They might have disastrous effects on McCain's governance, too. And I don't think that Romney is prone to either of those problems. You may remember a few debates ago they were talking about health care, and Romney started trying to explain, how his individual mandate in Massachusetts worked, and the moderator was saying, we're getting into the weeds, and Romney said, well, hey, the weeds are important. And I think that really was sort of a moment where you saw sort of into the soul of Mitt Romney. It's something I actually think is attractive and important in a contemporary president.
Well, yeah. You like Ronald Reagan, I assume.
Yes, I do like Ronald Reagan.
Not a weeds
Fair
guy.
enough.
And there is there's some. I mean, I think it's an interesting point. Certainly on domestic policy, McCain's answer to questions of domestic policy is generally, hey, domestic policy, real action is the war on terror. Let's talk about that now. But I don't. Maybe I should put this as a question to you.
Sure.
I don't have the sense. I don't have the knowledge to have the sense of McCain as having the same kind of political machine and set of political loyalties that Bush had coming into office. So for him to be appointing people who are, in his comfort zone and people who he gets along with, that could be a much wider and more talented group than the group of people who George Bush appointed, and which
There'll
is
be a lot more veterans. I'll tell you that.
A lot more yeah. Well,
it's
again,
you're
setting the bar pretty low.
Yeah, right. Actually, that gets to another point. It struck me. I mean, I think I wrote this maybe a year ago that if the Republican primary race ever became a McCain-Romney race, Romney would have the support of most conservatives. And I thought at the time, because I remember at that time McCain sort of in a way was the front runner, was the establishment candidate, that Romney would get a healthy share of the establishment of the GOP. And with most conservatives and a healthy share of the GOP, he would very likely win the nomination. Now I think it's possible that Romney's going to have most conservatives and most of the party establishment behind him, which is another reason why I don't think that McCain's lead in the national polls is quite as big an asset as a lot of his fans and the press would like to believe.
But you must be worried then about Romney running against Obama. As opposed to Obama running against McCain, because Romney runs against Obama, and Obama wins independent voters.
I think that's right.
Against Obama. Yeah,
I think that's right. Although the margin would matter. It would depend on. You need a pretty sizable percentage of the independents, but it's possible that he could do that. I think that Romney's Mormonism is conceivably a problem, not only with evangelical turnout for the Republicans, but also with swing voters, also with Democrats who might be inclined to cross the aisle. All the polling I've seen suggests that it's not just a problem for evangelical conservatives.
And so, what happens? So, when you're talking with broadly like-minded people. You say what you're saying now, McCain. I can live with that, despite my. And people say, "Hey, Ramesh, what about his views about immigration? What about his views about campaign finance reform? All the things that I like about McCain, and you don't like about him. What do you say to...
Well, I spent much of 2007 trying to make an argument for McCain with conservatives, and I found...
That's why I'm asking you.
Right, and I found two things to be true in making that case. One, there was always another sticking point. You could have been talking about this for 20 minutes, and then it would be, well, what about he wants federal regulation of boxing? Okay, well, there's always something else. And the second thing I found was...
This is McCain's mother's point the other day.
Right.
Mother
Roberta
said,
McCain.
Not a lot of support from the Republican Party for this guy. I'm sorry, go ahead, though.
Sure, no, but my second point is that, I was trying to explain to conservatives, some of your hostility to John McCain is irrational. And it now strikes me that was sort of an absurd thing to say, because if people actually do have an irrational hostility, it means they're not going to be reasoned out of it. And there is,
You mean, so it wasn't false what you said, it was just pointless?
Well, yeah, there is people formed, a lot of conservatives, one thing that one of the key moments where Newt Gingrich lost the budget fights of 1995, 1996 was when he had this crazy moment where he claimed that he'd shut the government down in part because Clinton had snubbed him on an international flight to Israel and back.
The crybaby moment, yeah.
Right. And that, I think, formed an impression of Gingrich and the Gingrich Republicans that lasted long. It affected the opinions of people who didn't even remember that after a while. Now, people may not even remember some of the specific things that happened in 01, 02, and 03 that made them form a negative impression of John McCain, conservatives, but they just remember they dislike him.
Yeah.
And they do remember some of the things they dislike him for.
Here's another, I think, a somewhat different take on it, and I'm, again, curious to know what you think about it. This is a group of people you spend a lot of time talking to. Here you have a bunch of people who, from my point of view, and maybe from yours too, people now in power, and lots of people in the Republican Party, who put an excessive value on loyalty. Loyalty is an important thing. I'm not disputing that, but I think we both agree that it's possible to put an excessive value on loyalty.
Sure.
And the hostility to John McCain comes from a kind of, a Republican Party form of identity politics. You're either one of us or you're not one of us, and if you're one of us, you're with us all the way, and somebody who's prepared to act independently with respect to, some pretty consequential issues like...
I was just yesterday I was reading Michael Medved's defense of McCain, and he says, it's a lie that he's not a loyal Republican. And I just thought, gosh, what a tedious argument to be engaged in. Who cares if he's a loyal Republican or not?
Right, but my point is, who cares?
I certainly don't want that on my gravestone.
Right, but who cares? My proposal is a lot of people do, and that and that this hostility to McCain comes from there being what I'm describing as a kind of Republican form of identity politics. You've got to be part of the team, and any departure from team play is completely inexcusable. When you add that these are departures from team play on what are arguably pretty consequential issues about taxes, about immigration, about campaign finance, and about torture.
But when people go on to say, he actually wouldn't do well in a general election because a lot of conservatives would sit it out, he'd have a base problem. I actually don't think that many of these disagreements are the sort of thing that would keep conservatives from voting for, an anti-abortion, veteran, war hero, who wants to name conservative Supreme Court justices and says he won't raise taxes. I think a lot of these things... how many conservatives are going to vote, are not going to show up to vote for a guy who matches that description because they disagree with him about global warming? I just find that sort of hard to believe that there are many people who are like that. It may be enough to cost him the nomination, but if he got the nomination, I don't think it would be a huge problem for him.
Issue about
immigration.
Turnout.
It would be the top issue that would be a problem.
I think it's I think they're. Look, we're speculating here, but what the hell? Why not continue? The issue there would be a kind of an enthusiasm and turnout issue, and that's where the question of who he's running against might make a difference. I could imagine people being energized to vote for McCain if he's running against Hillary Clinton and him winning a bunch of independent voters, and is also being able to mobilize turnout on the Republican side, because I do think it's Hillary Clinton's biggest liability is that she is her negatives. Whereas if he's running against an Obama and the political tone and style looks a little bit different, there may be a real kind of
I'm actually sort of a contrarian in that I think that in some ways Clinton's a tougher candidate in a general election than Obama would be. I mean, I agree that there's sort of more upside. There's sort of more variance in possible outcomes for Obama on as the presidential nominee, as opposed to with Clinton. I think you'd be stuck in a range where it's the final outcome somewhere between 47 and 53%. But one thing I keep seeing, Jonathan Chait made this point in the New Republic. Well, gosh, Clinton's negatives are so much higher than Obama's. To my mind, that's actually, if I were a partisan Democrat, that would be an argument for nominating her as opposed to against her.
Well, that's the Paul Krugman argument, though. That I think is the crux of the matter. If you think that you think high negatives, you think, well, listen, our opponents know something. This is the real meal here. But when I think about going,
look, if you look at the head-to-head polls. Yeah. Clinton, Obama doesn't run that much better than Clinton. His negatives are going to be much, much closer to what hers are by the fall, if he's the nominee, than they are to where he is now.
That could be.
It seems to me there's more room for him to fall.
It could be. And the variance point, I think, is a good one. My concern is less about electability. Who knows? Than about governance. I think that Hillary Clinton gets elected. I think those negatives are more stable, and she comes in and it's January 21st, and the negatives are about 43 to 45%, and we've got more politics of the same. Now, the thing that I think that makes a lot of difference, I think, if you've got a Democratic majority of about 54 to 46 in the Senate and maybe 20 seats in the House. If it happens that the economy continues to be in trouble and there's a little bit more noise coming out of Iraq, and it's like 1964. Could happen. It's 1964, and the Democrats run away with the store. Under those circumstances, I think Clinton would be a more effective president than Obama. Not transformative, but I think she would be better able to get things done. If you've got something that's more within the realm of expectation in terms of partisan divisions in the House and the Senate, under those circumstances, I think it would be a very unhappy 4 years in a Clinton presidency and a much better 4 years in an Obama presidency.
Yeah, I think we probably have enough time for each of us to make one more point, so I'll just say this. I think one thing that is likely to be true if the Democrats win the White House next year, this year that is, and they keep the congressional majorities. This is going to be, I think, for that president, a much more pliable Democratic majority than the one that existed in 1993-94. Because, I think one factor that people forget about when they think, for example, about the failure of the Clinton healthcare plan is just how complacent that majority was. It didn't feel that it could lose power. And I think you're going to have a much more disciplined Democratic majority going in next year, which is more reason for liberal hope, I guess, and more reason for conservative fear.
Right. Well, since you've made a point in favor of liberal hope, and we are out of time, I'll let that be the last point. It's good to talk, Ramesh, and I hope we do it again soon.
This was fun. Thank you.